On behalf of Archer and Carasoft, we would like to welcome you to today's podcast, focusing on government expectations of grant funding and discuss approaches to building a cohesive grant submission.
Today, this topic, this afternoon, we're going to talk about is the state and local cybersecurity grant program that was established with the passing of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I'm joined today by three very talented women. Elena Clark, who is the Assistant Director of Stakeholder Engagement for the for CISA at DHS. I'm joined by Montserrat Otten, who you all just heard from a few moments ago. And I'm joined by Stephanie Helm, who is the Director of Mass Cyber. Would you all like to take a moment and introduce yourselves, a little bit more about your job functions at each of your agencies?
Sure. So Elena Clark, I'm the Assistant Director for the Stakeholder Engagement Division. So my division oversees four main functions. One is the work that CISA does with the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, the 8 which CISA is responsible for. I also oversee a bunch of councils and boards that we administer for the director and a couple for the White House. We also have CISA International, so all of our international responsibilities for the agency. And the last area that I oversee is actually responsible for this grant that we'll be talking about today. So I'm overseeing the development and implementation of it. So really look forward to diving into that with you today.
I'm Stephanie Helm, a retired naval officer, 29 years as a CRIPI or Information Operations Officer. After I retired, I worked at the Naval War College, integrating cyberspace operations into wargaming. So we got to think about it from a variety of different angles in terms of how do you integrate the thinking of cyber into traditional activities, which set me up very well to work for the state of Massachusetts. So I run the Cybersecurity Center. We're part of the Mass Tech Collaborative. It looks at the innovation economy in the state of Massachusetts. The Mass Cyber Center's got 3 main mission areas. One is to conduct outreach. So we put on a number of events for Cybersecurity Month throughout the state. The second area is ecosystem development. In particular, we're very focused on workforce development. We are also running a mentorship program where we pair diverse cybersecurity college students with a mentor that's in the cybersecurity profession, and allow those students to be guided by their mentor for either a fall session or a spring session. So we're very proud of that program. And then thirdly, we are convening a resiliency working group, which has membership from federal partners, state agencies, local government, and private sector. And we look at areas where we can improve cybersecurity. We promote cooperation and planning. So incident response planning, not surprising from my Navy background, having a plan is very important. So I'm working with many of our state agencies on preparing for this grant program. So thank you.
I'll just briefly reintroduce myself, Montserrat Otten. I'm going to shorten it, the Chief Information Security Strategist for the City of Providence. My role is really looking at the infrastructure for our cybersecurity program and strengthening it from all areas: vendor management, risk management, incident response, any and everything, you name it, all things cybersecurity for the City of Providence.
Thank you. And thank you all very much for joining me tonight. So Elena, can you help us start things off with just kind of a general overview of the program, some of the milestones that are coming up? And I think the question that's on a lot of people's mind is the notice of funding opportunity related to the grant.
It is, yes, and I did already get that question walking in here. So first, I will say one huge thank you to all of our state and local partners that are here and also here virtually as well, because I've been working on the state and local side now with the Department of Homeland Security for about 15 years, and this has been an ask that you have had for many, many years. We need a dedicated funding source for cybersecurity within our state and localities. We need the help and we need the support, and I think it was highlighted even more more over the past few years with COVID and just some of the incidents that we saw happening in our communities and in your communities specifically. So a huge thank you also to Congress for hearing that ask and for including it in the infrastructure bill. So one thing I will say is standing up a grant program is definitely a lot of work. And I know the big question that everybody has is, when is the notice of funding opportunity coming out? We do hope it will be out in the coming months. There are just some additional complexities, I would say, with standing up a new grant program. Some of the traditional grants that FEMA has going out the door are pretty easy. They're on a cycle now. They come out very regularly. But this just requires, in the stand up, ensuring that we are working not only at DHS with our FEMA counterparts, but also with others in the interagency to make sure that we have all of the right requirements in it. We will then present it to the Secretary of Homeland Security for a final decision from a policy perspective, and I'll dive into it more through some of the questions that we have here today. But a lot of the requirements for the grant was very helpful that Congress spelled it out in the bill, so we can definitely dive into that more. But I'm very excited that we have this opportunity for our state and locals, because our adversaries have definitely noticed. And again, we just have continued to see incident after incident happen on state networks, on local networks, and we need to be able to work with you to build the resilience locally. So that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Montserrat, one of the requirements that that Elena alluded to is the need. There is going to be a cybersecurity requirement, or cybersecurity plan requirement, and local municipalities and states are supposed to work together to develop this plan. What would you like to see in your role as more of a local municipality leader? What would you like to see in terms of collaboration efforts at the state level?
So it's really important for me and for the city of Providence to make sure that our voice is heard at the state level, because they don't necessarily know what our needs are, right? So it's really important for us to be at the table as they're making decisions on disseminating the funds, so that they're not allocating it in areas that we don't need, right? So we have, Stephanie's actually on our advisory committee. We have an advisory committee in Providence where the state CISO sits on our committee. So we're in constant conversation to figure out what's going on at the state level and make sure that we're included at the state level. We also want to have conversations about, and I know we're going to get to this later, but what type of managed services can be shared across different municipalities throughout the state of Rhode Island. So we can't do that if we're not having regular ongoing conversations with the state. So luckily, we're a very small state and it's very easy for us to stay engaged, but we're continuing to do that. And we hope that once the funding does come down, that they'll continue to include us in their advisory committee that they're putting together around how the fund should be dispersed.
Stephanie, at the state level, obviously you've got different perspectives and the level of effort that you put into it. I know Massachusetts has been doing a lot of work to try and figure out how to bring together kind of the voice of those local municipalities. And Montserrat, mentioned that you all are even helping out with some of the other states as well. Can you talk a little bit about what you all were working on?
Yes. So the resiliency work that I mentioned earlier, the resiliency working group does have representation from several municipalities. And we recognized in 2019, when we started that working group, that municipalities were a special need area because of the vulnerability that many of the municipalities have and the lack of resources that many of them just don't have. We got 351 separate municipalities in the state. So you can imagine there's a variety of different architectures and unique cybersecurity problems. So we have been looking at engaging municipalities already. That's a currently existing process that we have in the state. So I'm happy to say that when we are looking at our planning efforts, we already sort of are engaged in communication with municipalities, and we have a sense of what some of their needs are. We don't know what, it's too difficult, I think, to generalize what everybody needs. One size will not fit all. And so trying to understand how we can use resources to the best ability is really the challenge that we're facing.
Sure. Yeah. Sounds like when you've got that many different municipalities, it can be a challenge just to kind of even figure out where to start. So it sounds like you're working in that direction. It's just going to take some time, which kind of leads to another question. I know it sounds like the notice of funding opportunity is probably a couple months away. which means that that's about, I think, what is it, about $200 million that needs to be allocated between the time that it is released and the end of the fiscal year. And we've got states that are actively working to try and put together these cybersecurity plans. One of the questions that we had discussed prior to this was, can some of that funding be used to help build that cybersecurity plan, or is a cybersecurity plan really required up front for states to take advantage of the funding opportunity?
So yes, absolutely. Some of the funding can be used for the plans. And one of the big things that we are actually pushing right now with our state and local partners is one of the requirements in the legislation is your planning committee at the state level. So ensuring right now that you understand as a state partner, as a local partner, how is that going to look in your state? The state has to put it together. A lot of states already have some type of planning committee that does handle grants. So understanding, are they going to use that planning committee and then make adjustments to comply with the legislation, or are they going to form something different? So start having those conversations with your state Homeland Security advisor, your state SAA, to understand what that is going to look like and to make sure that you have a seat at that table. Some of the specifics in the legislation is, 50% of the individuals that are on the planning committee have to have a technical background, IT or cyber background. There's also requirements for health and education. So just making sure that you're taking a look at what that legislation says and requires for your state planning committee, because that state planning committee is going to approve the plan with your state CIO, CISO, or equivalent. So it is so important right now. Do not wait for the notice of funding opportunity to come out to start asking some of those questions of the state so that you can have a voice at the table. And yes, the funding can be used to help with the development of the plan. And each state is probably in a different stage right now. Some states have plans, so it might just be a refresh, a review, so they might be a little bit farther along. And each year of this grant will build upon the work that the states and the localities are doing.
That's great information, I think, for everybody involved, because it sounds like a massive undertaking to try and pull everything together. So to know that there's a source that they can go to try and help fund some of that effort is definitely a reassuring thing, I think, for a lot of folks. Stephanie, one thing that stands out kind of in listening to you talk about the development of the plan in all these different municipalities is that, you've mentioned to me before that kind of the maturity level that some of these municipalities have is going to be at a different level, and it's going to kind of a varying scale, right? You've got rural municipalities that may not even have IT maturity, let alone cybersecurity maturity. And then you've got, cities like probably the city of Boston's probably a lot more mature, right? Or maybe not, I don't know, but
He's not old, he's just mature.
But the question I have is there an opportunity as part of this grant program potentially to look at managed services options to deliver? Because there's a requirement for 80% of the funding to go to local municipalities and not just at the state level. But I think there might be an opportunity for the state to deliver services directly to those municipalities. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly we have to look at how we can maximize the resources, because if we salami slice everything for 351 municipalities, we're not going to be able to make any difference. So,
right,
having some sort of service that we can provide is something that we're investigating. We've established something called the minimum baseline of cybersecurity for municipalities. It's a recommendation in 4 goal areas that municipalities evaluate themselves. They all map to CIS controls or NIST, but it's not in that language, because we're trying to hit the leadership of municipalities, because some of these small municipalities do not have a technician that they can easily consult. So first goal is employee training. The second is threat sharing, where we recommend they belong to MSISAC or get on the state Commonwealth Fusion Centers bulletin distribution. The third is having an incident response plan. And then the fourth area is best practices and good hygiene. So you can see that there might be an opportunity in any one of those goal areas for us to include that in the plan. There are already existing state grants that can help with some of these things, such as employee training, such as a health check from the state. So there are already state assets out there. In our drafting of the plan, because we have looked at the legislation and we kind of understand some of the categories that we expect to see in the NOFO, we've been taking those things that we currently have in place and putting those in categories as part of the plan, and then taking another look and saying, and if we had more money, what else would we add? Or do we just need to do more of something that we've currently got underway? So we're really trying to look at it, with a pencil, because until the NOFO comes out, you can't really establish the committee, because we want to make sure what is in the legislation is reflected in the NOFO. And then once we get the planning guidance in play from the NOFO, we've got at least a draft of where we are and where we might potentially go.
Montserrat, at the city level, what would you ideally like to see in terms of available services that the state might be able to provide?
So I think one is bringing all of the municipalities and the towns together to figure out what we can share across towns, right? Because right now, I definitely don't know. We don't connect with, at least from the city level, right? At the state level, it's very different. I think threat hunting, obviously, and best practices are going to be really important no matter what. But I think that there are other ways that we can share services with other folks within the state, but we don't know what those services could be without meeting, or convening with those other municipalities. And I think at the state level, if it's on them to sort of introduce that sort of setup, it makes it easier for us to jump in and go along with it, as opposed to us going to a small town or city and saying, hey, like, we want to, engage in this conversation with you simply because we think that we might be able to have a useful conversation. I feel like there's more credibility if it comes at the state level. So I would say there's a lot of possibilities, but it's hard to know without knowing what the other municipalities can offer us and vice versa.
And I would say that's one of the challenges we have, is having a baseline of where everybody is.
Yeah.
And that would be a very important component, we think, when we kick off the program, is sort of to say, can we do a survey that is, not painful to complete, that we could use that information to kind of judge where the, most impactful investments could be.
Sure. Yeah, I guess if having a funding source available to you is kind of prompting some of this. It sounds like the federal government is reaching some of the objectives that they kind of had in mind. In terms of being able, or I guess another question that was kind of thought about earlier as well, is what level of involvement, the money has to be distributed in support of 80% of the local municipalities. What level of involvement is CISA going to have in terms of, are they going to be like really strict about how that money is distributed? Are they going to be is a service-oriented architecture going to be something that is a little bit more, is available, something like that? Sorry, I'm stumbling over the question, but how integrated is CISA going to insert themselves into this particular process?
No, it's a great question. And we've been receiving a lot of feedback from our state and local partners, I would say, since the December timeframe. And that's been very helpful for us as we start to shape the notice of funding opportunity. So there is the requirement that there is an 80% pass through, and then also the 25% share with rural communities. The one thing we have heard from both localities and from the state is that if I slice this up to however many, and I know in New England, there's lots of towns and localities, it doesn't go far. So how do we do this? So the feedback on the managed service provider, that if we as a state can buy a service and then provide it out, it's much more cost effective for the localities. So we've definitely heard that feedback on numerous occasions from partners. So it is something that we have taken into consideration. And so we're definitely thinking through that for the final notice of funding opportunity. But that really will spell out the flexibilities that the states and localities will have with the funding. But definitely want to hit on, we've received the message on the managed services. So everyone we have spoken to prior to today has really driven that home with us.
That's great. It's good to hear. You mentioned earlier that this is really something the states have been asking for a long time. A lot of the state and local governments have been really asking the federal government for cybersecurity specific funding. And it's awesome that we're there. But obviously this is a good start. There's I think a desire that if this is successful, that it can be sustained over time. But you usually measure success through some sort of metrics. Can you talk a little bit about what CISA is going to be doing in terms of, or using in terms of metrics to kind of track progress?
I wish I could. Unfortunately, we will be spelling it all out in the notice of funding opportunity. So I'm really sorry that we can't provide more details today, but those are some final policy decisions that the Secretary of Homeland Security will make. And so we will identify what those metrics are. There are requirements in the grants, the 16 elements that are there. So there are some metrics that are already built into the legislation, but we'll probably add in a few additional ones as well. So more to come, and I apologize because there's a lot of questions that we're getting, and since the policy decisions haven't all been finalized, we're just not able to share.
Well, that's fine. We'll just set that up as a feedback opportunity for
appreciate it.
Stephanie and Montserrat to provide some insights into their concerns or thoughts on what metrics would help them be, successful or track, or what would concern them in terms of metrics.
I was gonna say, we would take both, what you would like to see and maybe what you would not like to see, because it's helpful to hear both sides of that. So definitely.
I think one of the things that we would not like to see are stringent metrics that can't be
Interpreted.
Yeah, across, because Providence is very different than Central Falls, right? And so you can't, I wouldn't say that you can't measure Providence and Central Falls in the same way, right? And so I feel like, so for example, NIST, right? Like that's the framework that most companies and municipalities are supposed to follow as best practices. But as Stephanie even mentioned, you have to tailor it to fit your specific needs, right? So even in that, it's really difficult to use a standard metric for every single municipality. And so I would say that having something that is more like a baseline rather than something that's stringent, because of the fact that I think that depending on where you're at, if you already have a cybersecurity plan versus whether you don't and you're just starting one up, it's going to be very difficult to sort of have everybody measure similarly across the board.
And one thing I will just add to that is we are working with FEMA, so they will be administering the money. And I would say over the many years of HSGP and UASI, lessons have been learned because there are some years where there was some very stringent language in those grants, and our state and local partners voiced that back to us. So I definitely think that there are some lessons learned that we've had along the way with other grants that the department has administered. So taking that into consideration from a policy perspective is something that we are very mindful of.
I would say the thing that I would recommend is looking at how elements of the plan are mutually supportive, because what I've heard from the grants that have come through and the FEMA grants that went to the Homeland Security, that it was up to each individual region on how they were going to spend that money. And they ended up doing, 1 year they do training, another year they would buy radios, another year they would do something else. And it was sort of not brought together in a holistic way. And so whatever the metrics are to look at individual investments, I think stepping back and looking at how does the plan hold together and address a variety of areas, which in the legislation, they've got a ton of things listed. And the one that I would highlight that I think is very important is workforce. I think trying to find talented people to work in cybersecurity is a challenge, and to have them work at a government rate is an even higher challenge. And so you're looking at municipalities that can't afford to have a full-time person. One of the things we're looking at is regional services, so that neighboring towns, particularly in Western Mass or Central Mass, the neighboring towns could get together and share a resource to include a CISO that might be able to represent their issues as a government employee, not as a vendor trying to sell individual things to towns. So looking at the plan holistically and measuring outcomes that way, I think would be maybe better than individual metrics of how many people took this test, kind of a thing.
I just want to co-sign what Stephanie said, because it's really, really hard, especially in Rhode Island. It's even worse in Rhode Island, to maintain good cybersecurity talent. I don't know what the solution is, but at the local level, it's really, really difficult. So any sort of mutual mutually aligned support would be really, really helpful.
I mean, just to that point, we're all competing for the same workforce at the state and local level, and then government, and then industry comes in and steals them.
There's a lot of money in industry, and that's all they can think of is going there, but
no, it's a good, very good point, and we'll take it. Thank you.
the program that you have, I don't know if it's a DHS or it's just a program, the Scholars for Service. I highly recommend continuing that, and that's one thing that I think we should all try to consider for our states. This is where cybersecurity college students can get their tuition granted for 2 years, and their payback for this program is that they take a government job, and it gets them involved as their first step into employment in the government service, and that's, I think, a healthy thing.
Yeah, at NASCIO, I heard several CISOs talk about trying to look at programs within their states for paid internships for college credit, and similar things, loan forgiveness type of opportunities for giving back to the state and get that talent while it's young, even if it's not the most mature and the most talented at the time. It gives you somebody to help with the challenge of trying to compete in a highly competitive cybersecurity workforce space. So, one question, I'm going to veer off script just for a minute because I think we've kind of already talked a lot about what your top priorities are in terms of trying to bring everything together. But this is, I think, related to that last question a little bit, and it was something that you touched on earlier in the earlier panel, and we talked about it last week a little bit. Is this idea of risk? A lot of metrics that are used are compliance-based metrics, and that may not be a one-size-fits-all opportunity for state and local governments, but perhaps looking at the risk levels and how you measure those risk levels for each of those municipalities might be a little bit more beneficial. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that?
So it's challenging because I think for us in the city of Providence, we're still trying to make sure that we are on the same page internally about what risk means, right? So I find that from the cyber side and the IT side, just getting the city employees to understand what risk is and why risk is important and how not all risk is bad, like you don't have to just you don't have to get rid of it, right? Like, it's not like, oh, we have risk, we have to like eliminate the risk. That's not what it's about. It's understanding risk priorities and managing it in the best possible way. So for us, I think it's more starting internally and making sure that we're on the same page about risk. And then perhaps externally, it makes it easier for us to engage with even the state level and then the federal level. But again, for me, relationships are the most important thing. That's what works in Rhode Island. On our advisory council, we have a CISA representative, we have an FBI representative, we have state representatives, we have out-of-state representatives. And for us, that's extremely important so that we're not making decisions in a vacuum. At least for me, it's really, really important that everybody's engaged so that I'm not making up a definition for the city of Providence that's very different than what CISA is going to say or what the state is going to say. If we're on the same page about these things, again, it makes it easier for us to go forward.
I think the important thing about characterizing the risk to municipal leadership is they understand risk in a variety of other ways because of the nature of their job. They know when a hurricane comes, when a blizzard comes, you name it, this is in their wheelhouse. And we have to represent the cybersecurity risk in similar terminology. And that also then will demonstrate why this is not an IT problem. This is a whole of government issue. Everybody's got to be on board, because if you have a significant cyber incident, it's going to affect all of the business operations. And you don't want it to affect health and safety, but potentially if it's an OT problem with the water system, there you have it. So I always start our meetings with a discussion of threat, like where are we, what's recently happened, and just to bring home the point that it could happen to you. When I took this job, many little towns, I got nothing anybody's going to care about. I don't have anything. And ransomware has totally changed that whole dynamic. Everybody is at risk because if they can get to you, they will, and they're going to make money off you one way or another. So using risk as a starting point for the conversation, I think is is very effective. And I think that would reach leadership in a good way.
And just to go off something that Stephanie said, I think, so to give you guys kudos, we had Mike come in to do a CRR assessment, and that was really helpful because what Stephanie just said, everybody's looking at it as an IT problem. And that was the first time that we put everybody in the room and everybody was like, oh my God. So that was really, as far as I know, so that was really helpful. But again, I think coming from me, and every organization is different. Coming from me, it's one thing. Coming from CISA, it's a very different thing. And I feel like eyes open up when they're like, oh, okay, so this is something that we need to make sure we take seriously.
Can you elaborate on what a CR assessment is?
It's a complicated assessment. It's how do I make it simple? It's an extensive, very extensive assessment on a particular critical area. So for us, we picked a specific area that we wanted to focus on that we thought was high risk, and we went from department to department to department to figure out how each department touches on that one area of risk. But there are different categories. I can't remember the categories, but it's pages and pages and pages and pages of categories where we're looking at people, process, and technology. So for every question that's asked, you're looking at it from the facility standpoint, right? And the, higher level management standpoint and the IT standpoint. And so getting everybody in the room together to say, okay, this might not be important to you, but this is why it's really important to the facilities manager. There was a lot of going back and forth with our facilities manager and our head of public safety to get on the same page. And so it was helpful to them to have that conversation in the room with everybody there. I hope that.
No, that's great.
Yeah. No, I haven't gone through it myself. I just speak about them. So it's to have someone who's gone through it. It's very, I know we have, and that was one of the points I was going to make before we close, is just our field staff have the ability to come in and sit with you and explain this in a very technical manner. But just to back up 1 minute on what Stephanie had said from a communication standpoint and risk, some of this is being able to communicate what cybersecurity is, what the risk is to your executives. And it's very challenging. I don't come from a cyber background. So one of the reasons that I'm here is to try and be able to explain this in a way that matters and that your executives, your leadership understands why this investment is needed, why this attention is there, that it's not just an IT issue, that it goes to every single employee within your organization. And that's something that we are continuing to work on at CISA, is just breaking this down so that you can talk about it with anybody, whether you're at work or you're at home. We've got to be able to educate the public a little bit better on this so that they can invest personally too.
Great. Thank you. So one last question for Stephanie and Montserrat. What are you most encouraged by with this grant program?
I'm encouraged that the requirement is to have a state plan, because being from the Navy, I think a plan is a great thing. And so, we've been working individually on a variety of different plans for the state, but this is one that has got a deadline to it that's going to have a real benefit once that plan is done, that will be eligible for the federal funding. And I think that's a really good thing. And I would just hope that, the legislation is extended or improved so that the funding line continues, but I realize that's to be determined.
I'll keep this short. I would say that we're just excited that there's a focus specifically on cybersecurity. We've been waiting for that for a while, and I think it just supports everything that we've been talking about and doing over the last few years. And now that there's funding at the federal level to back us and things that we've been working on, that's really supportive, and it helps us to tell our story internally. And again, like Stephanie said, we hope that this is just the beginning and it continues, for years to come.
I'll just echo that. I would say the fact that we finally have a dedicated source of funding for our state and local partners on cybersecurity is monumental. It's been something for years you have asked for. So the fact that we're here today with this dedicated line of funding, knowing that we have it for at least 4 years, is huge, and it's significant because we, again, the past couple of years with COVID, we've just seen, especially with ransomware taking over, the impact that it has had on our communities, and how it has just impacted all our critical infrastructure So it's just, I'm excited to see this because I've been in the conversation with our state and local partners for many years now. So huge recognition and thanks for all the work that you guys did in advocating for us to get here today.
Thank you. And now we're going to open it up to any questions, both in the room and online. Yes, you, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious. Looking at NASCIO, general consensus from most of the CIOs felt that if you did not already. I'm sorry. So it seemed the consensus coming out of NASCIO from the CIOs is if you didn't already have your cybersecurity plan in place and you did not have a specific use for the money that you could detail out to show what you use the funds for, if you're waiting till that memorandum comes out, it's too late. So from our perspective, we believe you'll have to have your plan in place and you'll have to have a specific use case for the money to get it. And if you don't do that before that memorandum comes out, you'll be behind. It'll be too late for that. So what do you think about that in regards to that sentiment?
So I'm just going to real quickly repeat the question for the folks online, and correct me if I get this wrong, but the common thought among CIOs is that there has to already be a cybersecurity plan in place, as well as use cases determined once the notice of funding is available in order to take advantage of the funding.
Well, you'll understand what you're going to use those funds
Correct.
for.
Understand what you're using that money for when that notice of funding becomes available.
So I'll say not necessarily, because we understand each state is at a different level. Some states might already have a plan in place, some might have a draft, but every state is at a different level, and we have taken that into consideration in developing the notice of funding opportunity. Although you reminded me of one other thing that I just wanted to make sure folks understood, that we have heard this feedback, is just period of performance and kind of being mindful of when this does get issued and where we are within the calendar year and where we are within each state's respective fiscal year. So that is something that we have definitely heard back from our state and local partners, of just keeping that at the forefront for when this does get released from a period of performance perspective.
Great question. Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? Yes, sir.
CISA has local cybersecurity experts and PSAs available to us. Is there going to be any funding to increase their services? Because they do provide good services, but getting time with them, because I think we have one PSA for all of Northern California, if I'm correct, and one or two cybersecurity folks for all of Northern California. It's just hard to get them to be able to come to our meetings and then tell us about the cybersecurity and help us sell it to our executives.
Sure. So once again, I'll repeat that for the folks online. CISA has local experts and cybersecurity experts that are available to state and local governments. However, they're not as readily available as we would like. So the question was, is there funding opportunities to increase the number of those available resources?
So great question. And hopefully everyone in the room is familiar with their local protective security advisor or cybersecurity advisor or state cybersecurity coordinator. And I know there are a couple states that we're still filling some of those positions with. But we are getting additional resources. We've actually received quite a few resources with the past funding year, but then also through the infrastructure bill as well. But I would say if there's a major gap, please reach out and let us know. We can definitely have a conversation with the regional director to understand where those gaps might be, so that they can help to adjust priorities that they might have within your respective state. And happy to provide my card after to anyone if you need assistance in getting connected.
Yes, sir.
Yes, we did have a question from out on the internet. So in addition to initial acquisition and implementation of cyber controls, are there grants for ongoing operations?
Do you need me to repeat that for the folks online, or I can? I just didn't know if you want. Can they hear you online or not?
They should be able to hear me.
Okay, great. Then I don't need to repeat it. Sure.
So DHS has a bunch of grants through FEMA, the Homeland Security Grant Program, the UASI program. So I know some of our states and localities are already using those programs for some cybersecurity purposes. And so there are additional resources out there. But again, this grant was created because we just kept hearing from state and locals, and Congress heard it too, that you needed your own dedicated resource. But that doesn't mean that as you are applying for other grants, whether it is HSGP or UASC, that you can't take cybersecurity practices into consideration when you're looking at those grants.
Are there any other questions in the room? Are there any other questions online? I was going to give Elena one last opportunity. If there's anything else that you wanted to recommend or suggest to states and local municipalities as they work together to try and take advantage of this opportunity.
So two things, I mentioned it already, but I'll just foot stomp it. Make sure you know how your state planning committee is being set up and that you have a voice at that table. And then second, to the gentleman's last point about our regional staff, we do have phenomenal regional staff. So make sure that you are connected with them because we're working very closely with them and we'll continue to work very closely with them as the notice of funding opportunity goes out the door because you will turn to them first before you call DC. So we need to make sure that they're armed with the information.
And with that, I think we're out of time. Thank you all so much for joining and taking the time with me on stage today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our Public Sector Day at RSA Conference podcast. If you would like more information on how we can assist your organization with cybersecurity needs, please visit www.carasoft.com/cybersecurity or email us at rsa@carasoft.com. Thanks for listening.